The Dark Scrolls. Some stories were never meant to be told, not because they lacked drama or consequence, but because they disrupted a fantasy the world desperately wanted to believe. The fantasy that royalty was perfection, that nobility meant flawless bloodlines and divinely ordained order. Within that illusion there was no space for brokenness, no room for deviation. And so, when children were born into royal households bearing signs of difference, most tragically, children with Down syndrome, they were not celebrated. They were erased. Their births were not met with gun salutes. No public statements were issued. No portraits commissioned. These children were whisked away, as if their very presence could undo centuries of carefully guarded reputation. And yet, behind every closed door, behind every whisper that went unanswered, there was a beating heart, a child, royal by blood, human by soul, forgotten by design. To understand this horror, we must not look only to medieval superstition or ancient cruelty. No, this silence endured deep into the 20th century, into the age of cameras, of global media, of coronations broadcast across continents. Even then, behind the polished facade of crowns and ceremonies, the old fear still ruled. It is said that the greatest palaces have the darkest rooms, those hidden chambers where inconvenient truths are locked away. And nowhere is this more evident than in the stories of royal children born with Down syndrome. Their fates are not simply tragic, they are devastating in how deliberately they were written out of history. In the early 1900s, nestled in the alpine lands of Austria, one such story unfolded in chilling silence. A noble family of high lineage welcomed a daughter, a girl with gentle eyes and a constant smile, who responded to the world with wonder. Her features were soft, her voice slow, her gaze lingering longer than others. But within days of her birth, she disappeared from public record. No baptism was announced, no photographs taken. She was sent away to a convent, hidden from view, her name sealed in private archives, her existence never publicly acknowledged. And when she died, her grave was unmarked. The world never knew her. Her family never mentioned her again. Some might argue it was the ignorance of the time, that people didn't understand genetic conditions, that they feared what they could not explain. But fear alone does not bury a child in secrecy. Fear alone does not cross a name out of family records. That takes intention. That takes shame. But perhaps the most infamous case, one that shook the foundation of the British royal image, occurred in the House of Windsor. In 1941, two sisters, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, were admitted to the Royal Earlswood Hospital for mentally disabled individuals. These young women were the nieces of Queen Elizabeth, first cousins to Queen Elizabeth II. They were not distant relatives. They were not forgotten by accident. They were removed deliberately. Born with Down syndrome, Nerissa and Catherine were, according to the royal family's official records, dead by 1961. Yet both were very much alive, living in an institution with no visitors, no correspondence, no acknowledgement. Nerissa lived until 1986, Catherine until 2014, and yet, in all those decades, the monarchy never spoke of them. They received no Christmas gifts, no royal mentions, not even a proper headstone. When Nerissa passed away, her grave bore only a simple plastic label marked with the letter N, not even her full name. No ceremony, no dignity. It was as if the very act of being born differently made her unworthy of remembrance. How did a family that built its identity on unity and tradition so easily cast away its own? How did the public, ever so eager to devour royal gossip, never question the absences? Because we were trained not to see. Royalty has always been about image, about projection. The spotless mirror, the flawless lineage, the sacred bloodline ordained by heaven. To admit that such a family could produce a child with a genetic condition was, in the eyes of some, to admit fallibility. to admit imperfection, to admit that they were, after all, only human. But Down syndrome is not a curse. It is not a tragedy. It is not a failure of genetics. It is a condition that brings challenges, yes, but also joy, love, laughter, and light. To those who have known a child with Down syndrome, they are not broken. They are beautifully different. And yet, in the royal courts of the 20th century, this difference was treated as a blemish so severe it had to be hidden behind locked doors. Imagine, if you will, a little girl born into royalty. Her brothers and sisters are announced to the world with fanfare, but her birth certificate is quietly filed away. She is taken from her mother's arms in the dead of night, bundled into a carriage, and delivered not to a nursery with silken sheets, but to a facility hidden from view. Her days are not spent learning etiquette or dancing in grand halls. She plays alone in small rooms with peeling wallpaper under the supervision of strangers. She calls out for her mother, but no one answers. Imagine a boy born with a crown in his blood and a softness in his speech. He smiles at the nurse, claps his hands when he hears music, but no one teaches him to bow. No one calls him Your Highness. No one includes him in the family portrait. His laughter echoes down long, quiet corridors, but no one hears it in the palace. The greatest cruelty here is not the condition itself. It is the deliberate denial of love, of inclusion, of worth. These children were not simply hidden. They were stripped of their place in the world. They were made invisible. They were denied the most basic dignity, to be known. Why? What drives a family to do this? Was it the fear of public shame, the pressures of legacy, the cold calculus of advisors and image consultants? Perhaps it was a combination of all these things. Perhaps for some, the appearance of strength was more important than the reality of humanity. But history remembers what it can never explain. In quiet cemeteries across Europe lie the forgotten graves of royal children who never wore a crown, never spoke a word in court, never appeared on a postage stamp. They were royal in name only, if even that. Their lives were reduced to silence, their deaths to footnotes. And yet, their existence tells us something more profound than the tales of battles and successions. It tells us that power, true power, is not measured in gold or titles, but in the capacity to love without condition. The real tragedy was not in their births. It was in how the world and their own families failed them. What is a dynasty worth if it cannot embrace its most vulnerable? As the world changes, slowly, painfully, we begin to look back on these stories not just with pity, but with fury, with grief, with the aching knowledge that something sacred was lost, not just a life, but a truth, a chance to be better, a chance to care. The castles remain, gleaming and proud, but their shadows still carry the echoes of children's voices, gentle, forgotten, longing to be heard. And now, perhaps, we are ready to listen. We owe them that much. History rarely hides things by accident. Forgetting, especially on a national scale, is a conscious act. It requires systems. It requires complicity. And when it comes to the silent vanishing of royal children born with Down syndrome, the silence was not born from a single choice. It was a machine, well-oiled, generational, and precise. By the time a child of nobility was born, the machinery was already in place. Palace physicians were the first to know. In an age before prenatal testing, the first clues would come within hours of birth. Low muscle tone, a unique shape of the eyes, a flat nasal bridge. Medical staff trained to spot deviation understood what it meant. But unlike in ordinary families where a diagnosis might inspire concern or care, in royal households it triggered something darker. A rapid, carefully choreographed response designed not to heal, but to hide. The doctor would lower his voice. A nurse might be quietly dismissed. Within the hour, a courier would be sent. not to fetch treatment, but to summon those responsible for public image, courtiers, advisors, men in polished shoes whose job was not to love the child, but to protect the throne. The child's condition was discussed behind closed doors, often with the mother still in recovery. Official announcements were delayed or never issued at all, and as the hours passed, decisions were made, quietly, coldly. If the family chose exile, disguised as care, then the child would be transferred to a private institution, often under a false name, often accompanied by an altered birth certificate. Some were sent to religious homes where the staff knew better than to ask questions. Others were placed in private facilities where records could be sealed by royal decree. The message was clear. This child, though born of royal blood, would not be part of the royal future. And yet, despite these orchestrations, the child still lived, still breathed, still smiled, still waited for visitors who never came. Institutions, especially in the early to mid-20th century, were not havens of compassion. Even for the common citizen, they were often bleak, underfunded, and cold. For children with disabilities, they could be brutal. Rooms were shared. Privacy was non-existent. Medical care was minimal. Staff turnover was high. Physical punishment was not uncommon. Now imagine such a place. But for a royal child, imagine a girl whose bloodline traced back to emperors, who might have grown up with titles, education, jewels. Instead, she sits on a metal-framed bed, sharing her space with strangers, wearing donated clothes, her hair cut short for hygiene. She doesn't know why no one comes. She still remembers the soft silk of her baby blanket, the warmth of arms that once held her. But those arms never returned. As she grows, she learns not to ask questions, not to cry when letters never arrive, not to expect a cake on her birthday. Meanwhile, outside the walls, her family smiles for cameras. They wave to adoring crowds. They pose in palaces where her picture never hung. They build narratives of continuity, of power, of blessed perfection. And the public, hypnotized by tradition, never asks about the missing children. Because the silence isn't just inside the palace, it's in society itself. Disability for centuries was equated with weakness. In many cultures, it was seen as divine punishment, a flaw of character, or a threat to order. In royal families, where lineage meant everything, any deviation was viewed as a potential disruption of legitimacy. In monarchies that ruled by divine right, how could a king father a child deemed imperfect? What would it say about the bloodline? About God's will? And so the answer was denial. Some children were declared stillborn, though they were not. Others were listed in family trees as having died in infancy, while living for decades behind locked doors. Records were altered, graves left unmarked, photographs destroyed. And this wasn't just limited to the British or Austrian monarchies. Across Europe, in Spain, in the Netherlands, in the minor duchies of Germany, similar stories whisper through the archives. A prince who vanished from public life. A child whose name appears in one baptismal record, then never again. Some of these children, miraculously, survived into old age. They lived quiet lives in care homes, befriended by staff, remembered for their gentleness. And occasionally, rarely, a journalist or historian would stumble upon the truth. In the late 1980s, when the case of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon was uncovered by the press, the public reaction was one of shock, even outrage. But the palace refused to comment. They offered no apology, no tribute, no acknowledgement. Why? Because to acknowledge them would be to admit they existed, and to admit they existed would be to admit they were hidden. It would fracture the myth. And myths, once fractured, are hard to repair. But let's step back. What does it do to a nation, to a people, when its most powerful families erase their vulnerable members? What message does it send to the countless other children with disabilities? To the parents struggling to provide care? It says, you are shameful. You are better off unseen. The royal family, whether they wished it or not, set the moral tone of the time. Their rejection of these children was not just personal, it was cultural. It gave cover to schools that excluded, to doctors who advised institutionalization, to families who felt pressured to hide their own sons and daughters. In this way, the silence became a storm. Widespread, devastating, multi-generational. It is easy now to look back in judgment, to say they should have done better. But it is not enough. We must ask harder questions. Why did no one speak up? The staff who cared for these children, did they remain silent out of duty or fear? The siblings who visited royal estates, did they ever ask where their brother or sister had gone? The mothers, did they weep behind closed doors, or did they convince themselves that separation was for the child's own good? We may never know. Royal correspondence is tightly guarded. Diaries remain unpublished. Letters mysteriously disappear. Even modern biographers struggle to confirm details, facing resistance from archives and royal press offices. And yet, traces remain. One nurse remembered a young woman who loved music. She would tap her fingers on the window pane in rhythm. Another caregiver described a boy who stared out the window for hours, watching for carriages that never arrived. They remembered, even if history did not. What stands out most is the resilience of these children. Despite the abandonment, they formed friendships. They found joy in small routines. Some learned to write, others painted. They laughed, they cried, they lived, not as royalty, but as people. They deserved better. As the 21st century approached, things began to change. Societal attitudes toward disability shifted. Advocacy grew louder. Visibility increased. And with it came a reckoning, not just for the public, but for institutions that had long operated in secrecy. Some royal families began to acknowledge past mistakes. Others remained silent. But the truth, once unearthed, could no longer be buried. Still, for many of these children, justice came too late. They died without family at their side, without names on their gravestones, without portraits in the halls they were born to walk. And yet, through the cracks of history, their light still shines. They remind us that worth is not conferred by title, that dignity is not reserved for the perfect, that love, when withheld, becomes a wound that echoes for generations. These children were not mistakes. They were not embarrassments. They were human, precious. And now, at last, they are being seen. We must tell their stories, not to shame the past, but to ensure the future does not repeat it. Because the worst thing we can do is look away. The history of monarchies is filled with names etched into marble, painted into gold, spoken in hushed reverence. But for every royal child born to privilege and groomed for power, there are others whose names were whispered only behind closed doors, if they were spoken at all. They are not part of the grand lineage charts, nor do they grace the halls of palaces. Yet their existence, however fragile, changed everything. Because they cracked the illusion. They revealed that beneath the crowns, these families were not gods, but people, and people hide what they fear. Among the most haunting and documented cases remains that of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, the nieces of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Part of the aristocratic Bowes-Lyon family, their lineage tied directly to the British Crown. Born in 1919 and 1926, respectively, they showed signs of cognitive impairment early on, what modern medicine would understand as Down syndrome, at a time when mental disabilities were not only misunderstood, but actively stigmatized. This diagnosis became an existential threat to the pristine image of the royal bloodline. In 1941, both sisters were quietly placed in the Royal Earlswood Institution for Mental Defectives, a hospital in Surrey known for housing people with learning disabilities. They were young, barely women. Their names appeared in no royal announcements, no formal correspondence, and no photographs. For decades, they were absent from public knowledge. Their own relatives believed them dead. At least, that's what official royal genealogies claimed. The 1963 edition of Burke's Peerage, an authoritative record of British aristocracy, listed both girls as having died in the 1940s. A lie printed in plain sight. But they were alive, forgotten but breathing, hidden but still waiting. When the press uncovered their existence in the 1980s, Nerissa was already gone. She had died in 1986 at the age of 66, buried in a grave marked only with a plastic tag that read, N. Bowes-Lyon. No flowers, no family, no ceremony. Catherine at that time was still alive, alone, nonverbal, often curled into herself. She would live until 2014. The palace offered no real comment, no public apology, no explanation. And perhaps that silence was louder than anything they could have said. It spoke of generations conditioned to see difference as danger. To them, protecting the image of strength meant burying vulnerability. But the Bowes-Lyon sisters were not the only ones. In the 1930s, Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, showed early signs of epilepsy and possible developmental disorders, though records remain vague, possibly deliberately so. From age 11, he was removed from public appearances. His seizures became more frequent, his speech delayed. He was sent to live at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, away from court, accompanied only by a governess and servants. His siblings rarely visited. He died at age 13 during a severe seizure. His funeral was quiet. His name, though not erased, was largely footnoted in royal biographies. Some claimed it was to spare him the cruelty of public life. Others see in it the same pattern. Remove the child who doesn't fit. And while Britain offers some of the clearest documented cases, similar patterns unfold across European nobility. In Germany, historical whispers surround the children of minor royal houses during the Nazi era. Families who once paraded their heirs in military regalia now face the terrifying ideology of racial purity. A child with a disability was not just a private sorrow, it was a political liability. Some noble families who had supported the Third Reich were quick to conceal or institutionalize children with any sign of disability. A few went further, subtly cooperating with state-run euthanasia programs under the guise of mercy. The idea of a flawed heir was unbearable in a world where blood was everything. In Spain, Infanta Pilar, sister to King Juan Carlos, had a younger sister who, according to palace insiders, was born with a severe disability and died in infancy. The records are brief. The mentions are hushed. But old staff members from the Zarzuela Palace speak of a nursery that was abruptly emptied and never spoken of again. The absence of documentation is itself a kind of presence, a void too perfect to be natural. We might never know the full scale. For every story that emerges, there are likely dozens that remain hidden under archival locks, family secrets, or burned letters. But what we do know, what we must cling to, is that these were not ghosts. They were children. They had names, even if we do not know them. They had birthdays. They loved and were capable of being loved. Some found solace in unexpected places. One caretaker, decades after retiring from a royal-affiliated institution, spoke anonymously about a girl named Lily. Her last name was never shared with staff, but she had the delicate posture of someone raised with formality. She refused to eat with her hands, always used a spoon and fork, and instinctively curtsied when strangers entered the room. The staff suspected her origins. They'd heard the rumors, but they respected her silence. She died in her 50s, surrounded not by royalty, but by nurses who sang to her, who read her poetry, who held her hand. Another story tells of Henrik, a boy with Down syndrome born into a minor Scandinavian royal family. He was never listed in public documents, but his older sister, now a duchess in her own right, began leaving yellow tulips anonymously on the steps of a church every year on his birthday. She never spoke about it, but locals knew, and when she passed, the flowers still appeared. No one knows who leaves them now. These are stories of grief, yes, but also resistance, quiet resistance, the refusal to let memory die, the refusal to let shame win. As the 21st century unfolded, some royals began to acknowledge the past, not loudly, but gently. In recent years, Princess Victoria of Sweden, heir to the throne, has spoken publicly about inclusivity and the importance of disability rights. Her daughter has participated in educational programs alongside children with special needs. In Norway, King Harald has openly supported institutions working with mentally disabled children, shaking hands, hugging them, looking them in the eye, not as symbols, but as people. These gestures matter. They do not undo the past, but they signal a turning, a reckoning, a desire to step out from behind the velvet curtain of perfection and into the human light. But for many monarchies, especially those still clinging to the mythology of infallibility, these steps come slowly, too slowly. The question remains, what are they afraid of? That the public will stop believing in royalty if they learn it is not immune to struggle, that compassion is weakness, that admitting to the existence of hidden children will stain the pages of national pride? If so, they misunderstand the times we live in. Today, strength is no longer defined by silence. Real power is not in pretending to be perfect. It's in embracing the imperfect with grace. We want our leaders, royal or not, to show us what humanity looks like under pressure. And humanity includes vulnerability. It includes pain. It includes children who don't fit molds but who still deserve love, respect, and presence. The stories of these hidden royal children, heartbreaking as they are, now serve as mirrors. They reflect back not just on palaces, but on ourselves. What do we hide? Who do we exclude? Whose stories do we forget? As these shadows come to light, the weight of collective silence becomes harder to bear. And with that weight comes a choice. We can look away, or we can say their names, even if history never did. History is not a still photograph. It breathes, it shifts, and sometimes, if we let it, it apologizes. For centuries, royal families across Europe moved like clockwork. Each child born was announced with trumpet and title, a promise of continuity, of future power. But hidden in the ticking mechanisms of succession were broken cogs, children whose only crime was being born different. They were silenced not because they were unloved, but because love in a royal court often comes second to image. And so the world built mythologies on spotless bloodlines while real children vanished behind veils of shame. But myths grow brittle, and truth, once spoken aloud, can never be fully buried again. In the wake of investigative revelations, like the discovery of the Bowes-Lyon sisters or Prince John's quiet life, public perception of royalty began to shift. Not in outrage alone, but in heartbreak. The people were not angry because the crown had imperfections. They were heartbroken because those imperfections had been treated like stains instead of stories. In the decades that followed, modern monarchies began walking a thin, trembling line between maintaining tradition and embracing transparency. Some did better than others. In the Netherlands, Queen Maxima has publicly supported programs for children with special needs. She has visited inclusive schools, posed for photos with disabled children, spoken about the need for visibility. But while the gesture is warm, the silence surrounding her own family history, if there were any hidden children, is still palpable. The line between compassion and confession remains carefully managed. In Spain, the monarchy remains fiercely guarded. The veil over its past, especially during and after the Franco regime, remains thick. Rumors of hidden infants, of children placed in orphanages under different names, circulate in hushed academic circles. But archives remain sealed and questions unanswered. Even in Britain, perhaps the most scrutinized monarchy on earth, the legacy of royal children with disabilities remains an unresolved wound. The royal family never officially commented on the full circumstances of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon's abandonment. There was no statement of regret, no royal visit to their graves, no invitation to rewrite the public record, only the quiet hope that time, again, might do the burying. And yet, something has changed. Perhaps it is the age of the internet, where nothing stays hidden. Perhaps it is a generational shift in values. Or perhaps it is the unrelenting work of advocates, historians, and families who refuse to let these lives be forgotten. Whatever the reason, the public no longer accepts silence as an answer. And royalty, once shielded by divine narrative, now finds itself accountable to something far more enduring than bloodlines: human decency. In recent years, countries around the world have reevaluated how they treat people with Down syndrome. Inclusion programs have expanded. Representation in media has grown. Laws have shifted to favor dignity and access over pity or isolation. And through this lens, the stories of the forgotten royal children appear all the more tragic. Because what happened to them could have been different. It didn't have to be this way. They could have lived in their palaces. They could have had tutors and therapists. They could have been seen, loved, remembered. Their birthdays could have been celebrated, their hands held in public, their laughter echoing through gilded halls. They could have been symbols, not of shame, but of courage. Imagine what it would have meant for a queen to stand beside her child with Down syndrome and say, "This is my son. This is my daughter. They are not broken. They are part of me." That simple act would have broken centuries of silence. It would have changed everything. But no one did. Not then. Instead, caretakers lit candles in quiet chapels, nurses named graves with plastic tags, sisters left tulips on stone steps, and archivists, decades later, stumbled across redacted documents and began to ask, who were they? And we, the world, began to listen. There's a strange power in remembrance. It cannot undo what was done, but it can unmake the shame. It can return dignity, however posthumously, to those who were denied it in life. That is the work of reckoning. Not vengeance, not blame, but truth-telling. That reckoning has already begun. In literature, documentaries, even subtle shifts in how monarchies present themselves today, we see glimpses of atonement. Royal families now speak more freely about mental health, about neurodiversity, about inclusion. The camera pans wider, shows the wheelchair at the edge of the frame, the child who flaps his hands while smiling at a distant cousin in uniform. These moments are small, but they are seismic compared to the silence of the past. Still, gestures are not justice, and for many the apology has yet to come. The truth remains incomplete. Names are still missing from trees, photographs still mysteriously absent from family albums, documents still marked confidential until 2099. Some wounds are too deep for time alone to heal. They require voice. And so we speak, not just for Nerissa and Catherine, not just for Prince John, but for the unnamed, the undocumented, the erased. We speak for the child whose only legacy is a hospital ledger, for the boy whose laughter never reached his brother's ears, for the girl who danced alone to no music in a locked room. We speak because they couldn't, and in that speaking we begin to reclaim what royalty tried so long to suppress, that difference is not disgrace, that every life, crowned or common, is worthy of being seen. In the future, perhaps we will see monarchies that embrace this truth completely. that tell their stories honestly, that name every child, that acknowledge the pain not as scandal, but as part of the human thread. Because royalty, in the end, is nothing without humanity. A crown without compassion is a hollow ornament, and a history that omits its most vulnerable is not a history. It is propaganda. So we remember. We remember not with bitterness, but with clarity. Not to dwell in the cruelty, but to ensure no child again will be hidden for the sake of a portrait. Not to shatter tradition, but to soften it with grace. Let the castles have their mirrors. Let them reflect the truth. Not just the perfect smiles, but the missing ones too. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.